They called him the Giant of Vicksburg, a 7-foot freedman who built bridges in war and peace in a land that never wanted either. For years, Jonas Clay tried to live quiet, raising his daughter, tending his land, pretending the world had changed. But one night, 9 riders in white rode through the woods, bringing fire, rope, and the memory of every chain he ever broke. They came to burn his home, to make an example of the giant who wouldn't bow. What they didn't know was that Jonas had already dug the trenches, set the oil, and waited for justice to come riding. In 3 minutes, 9 men met the wrath they thought they owned. And when the sun rose, the legend of Jonas Clay began, not as a hero, but as a warning. The 7-foot giant who killed 9 Klan men in 3 minutes, based on a true legend of vengeance and fire. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Dawn broke slow over the pines. The light came pale and thin through the branches, casting long shadows across the clearing where Jonas Clay stood with his axe. The blade rose and fell with perfect rhythm. Each swing split the wood clean through. The sound echoed sharp against the morning quiet. Jonas was a giant among men, 7 feet tall, with shoulders like oak beams and hands that could span a man's chest. His skin was dark as river clay, scarred from years of labor, first in chains, then in war. He wore simple clothes, homespun trousers and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the cool air. Behind him, the cabin sat nestled against a stand of pines. It was small, but sturdy, built with Jonas's own hands after the war ended. The roof was good cedar shake. The chimney drew smoke straight up. A vegetable garden stretched along the south side, neat rows of beans and squash climbing their stakes. Eliza worked there now, her skirt tied up to keep it from the dirt. She was smaller than most women, delicate-boned and graceful. Her hands moved quick through the soil, pulling weeds and checking the plants for bugs. She had been taught to read once, back when she served in a big house before the war. That learning showed in the way she carried herself, proud but careful, knowing when to speak and when to keep silent. Near the porch, their daughter Ruth sat cross-legged on the steps. She was 8 years old, all skinny legs and bright eyes. She hummed a song her mother taught her, something about rivers and freedom. Her voice was sweet and high, threading through the morning like birdsong. Jonas set down his axe and wiped his hands on his trousers. The pile of split wood had grown tall enough. He turned toward the cabin and studied the roof line. There was a spot near the chimney where the shakes had started to curl. Water would get in come winter if he didn't fix it soon. "Papa," Ruth called out, "you gonna climb up there?" "Need to," Jonas said. His voice was deep and quiet, like distant thunder. "Roof won't fix itself." He fetched his ladder from the shed and leaned it against the cabin wall. The climb was easy despite his size. He moved with careful precision, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. At the top, he pulled himself onto the roof and sat straddling the peak. From up here, he could see far across the clearing. The forest pressed in on 3 sides, thick with pine and oak and sweet gum. A dirt road ran past the front of the property, rutted from wagon wheels and spring rains. Beyond that, more trees, miles of them, stretching toward town. Jonas pulled a handful of nails from his pocket and got to work. He pried up the damaged shakes and laid down new ones, driving the nails home with steady strikes. The work felt good, simple, the kind of labor that didn't require thinking beyond the next hammer blow. The sound of wagon wheels made him pause. 2 men came down the road in a buckboard pulled by a single mule. They were white, both of them wearing straw hats against the sun. The driver had a thick beard shot through with gray. The other man was younger, clean-shaven, with narrow eyes that darted across the clearing. They slowed as they passed. The bearded man said something Jonas couldn't hear. The younger one laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Then the bearded man called out, "That's him," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "The giant of Vicksburg." Jonas kept working. He didn't look down. The younger man stared up at him. "Big as they say. Maybe bigger. Saw him carry a whole bridge timber by himself during the siege," the bearded man said. "Union boys called him a hero. Ain't that something?" The word hero came out twisted, like it was something dirty. Jonas drove another nail. The wagon moved on. He waited until the sound of wheels faded, before he let himself breathe out slow. The giant of Vicksburg. He hated that name, hated what it meant, the weight of memory it carried. During the war, he had served with the Corps of Engineers, building bridges and roads for the Union Army. At Vicksburg, when the rebels shelled their position, Jonas had dragged 3 wounded men out of the river, while timber burned around him. The other sappers said he moved like he couldn't be killed, like bullets bent around him. But Jonas remembered the fear, the way his hands shook afterward, the screaming. He finished the roof work and climbed down. Eliza stood at the edge of the garden, watching him. Her face was calm, but her eyes held worry. "You hear them?" she asked. "I heard." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Folks been talking again in town. I heard it from Sarah when she came by yesterday. That new preacher's stirring things up. Reverend Dunley. That's him." Eliza's voice dropped. "He's been preaching about restoration, about Southern honor and the old ways. Says freedmen, like you, forgot their place." Jonas looked at the pile of split wood, at the garden, at his daughter on the porch, everything he had built with his own hands, his own sweat, his own blood. "We need supplies," Eliza said. "Flour's running low. Need lamp oil, too. I'll go tomorrow." "Jonas," she stepped closer. "Be careful in town, please." He nodded. Careful. He had been careful his whole life. Careful as a slave. Careful as a soldier. Careful now as a freedman trying to keep his family safe. But careful only went so far when men looked at you and saw something they wanted to destroy. The next morning, Jonas hitched their old mare to the wagon and headed into town. The road was dry and dusty, the sun already hot despite the early hour. He passed other cabins along the way, some occupied by freedmen, others by poor whites who worked small farms. Most folks waved, some didn't. Town sat at a crossroads, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a church. The church was new, built after the war with white-painted boards that gleamed in the sunlight. A tall steeple reached toward the sky, topped with a wooden cross. Jonas tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The air was cooler here, smelling of flour and tobacco and coffee. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with goods. A white man stood behind the counter, Mr. Grimes, who ran the place. He was older, gray-haired, with thick spectacles that made his eyes look huge. "Morning, Jonas," Grimes said. His voice was neutral, not friendly, but not hostile either. "Morning." Jonas handed over his list. "Need these things." Grimes read it over and nodded. He started gathering items, a sack of flour, a tin of lamp oil, some sugar wrapped in brown paper. As he worked, the door opened behind Jonas. 3 white men walked in. They wore work clothes, but their boots were good leather, not the cheap kind. One of them, tall, with a sharp face and cold eyes, stopped when he saw Jonas. "Well," the man said, "look who's shopping like a regular citizen." Jonas didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Grimes, who had gone very still behind the counter. "Got business here, same as you," Jonas said quietly. "That right?" The tall man stepped closer. "Heard you were quite the hero during the war. Union sapper, builder of bridges." He said the words like they were insults. "Must think you're something special." Jonas turned slowly. The 3 men stood blocking the door. The tall one in front, the other two flanking him. Their faces held the same expression, contempt mixed with something uglier, something that wanted an excuse. "Just buying supplies," Jonas said. "Don't want trouble." Nobody said there was trouble. The tall man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Just making conversation. You know how to talk, don't you? Or did they only teach you how to take orders?" Grimes cleared his throat. "Got your things here, Jonas." Jonas moved to the counter and paid. The coins clinked as he set them down. He gathered his supplies and turned back toward the door. The three men didn't move. "Excuse me," Jonas said. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the tall man stepped aside, just enough for Jonas to squeeze past. As Jonas walked through, the man leaned in close. "Reverend Dunley's been talking about you," he whispered. "Says men like you need reminding. About honor. About respect." He smiled again. "Best you remember that." Jonas walked out into the sunlight. His hands were steady as he loaded the supplies into his wagon, but his heart hammered against his ribs. He climbed onto the seat and took up the reins. As he left town, he passed the church. Reverend Dunley stood on the steps, talking to a group of white men. The preacher was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a voice that carried. He wore all black, like a crow. "The South shall rise again," Dunley was saying. "Not through arms, but through restoration of God's natural order, through honor and discipline and the remembrance of righteous hierarchy." The men around him nodded. Some glanced at Jonas as his wagon rolled past. Their eyes were hard. Jonas kept driving. The road stretched ahead, winding through the pines toward home. The weight in his chest didn't ease until town disappeared behind the trees. The sun was starting to sink when Jonas turned onto the narrow track that led to his cabin. The mare knew the way, plodding steady through the ruts. Jonas let his mind drift, thinking about what needed doing tomorrow. The fence needed mending. The chicken coop wanted a new door. Then he saw it. A tree near the property line, just where the road met his land. Someone had carved into the bark. The cuts were fresh, the wood pale and raw beneath. A cross, small and crude, but unmistakable. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat there, staring at the carved symbol. A warning, silent but clear. His hands tightened on the reins. The mare shifted, uneasy. From the cabin, Eliza appeared in the window. She must have heard the wagon. But then she saw Jonas sitting motionless on the road, saw where he was looking. Her hand went to her mouth. Jonas climbed down from the wagon. He walked to the tree and traced the carving with his fingers. The cuts were deep, made with purpose. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Eliza stood on the porch, Ruth peeking out from behind her skirts. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The peace of the clay homestead, fragile as morning dew, began to crack. That evening, the fireflies came out. They drifted through the trees like tiny lanterns, blinking on and off in the gathering darkness. Jonas sat on the porch steps, watching them. Ruth was inside, getting ready for bed. He could hear Eliza's voice through the open window, soft and steady, as she helped their daughter change into her nightgown. The carved cross still burned in his mind. He kept seeing it, the fresh white wood, the deliberate cuts. Someone had stood at his property line with a knife and taken their time, made sure it would be seen. The door opened behind him. Eliza stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. She sat down beside him, close enough that their arms touched. "What does it mean?" she asked quietly. "The mark on the tree." Jonas didn't answer right away. He stared into the darkness where the fireflies danced. A nightbird called from somewhere in the pines, a long, mournful sound. "It's a promise," he finally said. His voice was low. "One they mean to keep." Eliza's hand found his. Her fingers were small and warm. "Jonas, I know." They sat in silence. Inside, Ruth's voice rose in a sleepy question, then fell quiet again. The frogs had started their evening chorus down by the creek. Their croaking filled the air, almost loud enough to drown out thought. "What are we going to do?" Eliza whispered. Jonas looked at his hands. They were huge, scarred from years of labor. During the war, these hands had built bridges strong enough to carry cannons, had pulled drowning men from rivers, had dug graves in frozen ground. But what good were they now? What could they build that men with hate in their hearts couldn't tear down? "Tomorrow I'll go see Caleb," he said. "Find out what's really happening." Eliza nodded. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed that way until the last light faded from the sky and the fireflies stopped blinking. When they finally went inside, they found Ruth asleep on the rug near the hearth. Her doll clutched tight in her arms. Jonas lifted her gently and carried her to bed. He lay awake long into the night, listening to his wife's breathing beside him and the creaking of the cabin in the wind. Morning came gray and cool. Mist hung in the trees, making everything look ghostly. Jonas saddled the mare before the sun fully rose. He told Eliza he'd be back by afternoon and rode out while the dew still wet the grass. The road to town felt longer than usual. Every shadow between the pines seemed to hide watching eyes. Jonas kept the mare at a steady walk, his back straight, his face calm. But his hand never strayed far from the long knife he wore at his belt. He didn't go to the main part of town. Instead, he turned down a side road toward the forge. Caleb Turner's blacksmith shop sat at the edge of the colored settlement, a low building with a chimney that already poured smoke into the morning air. Jonas could hear the ring of hammer on anvil before he saw the place. The familiar sound eased something in his chest. He tied his horse and walked inside. The forge blazed hot and bright. Caleb stood at the anvil, a stocky man in his early 40s with arms thick as fence posts. He wore a leather apron covered in scorch marks, and sweat already darkened his shirt. When he saw Jonas, he set down his hammer. "Brother," Caleb said. His voice was rough from years of breathing forge smoke. "Didn't expect you this early." "Need to talk." Caleb's smile faded. He glanced toward the open door, then moved to close it. "That kind of talk." "Yeah." They went to the back of the shop where Caleb kept a small table and 2 chairs. He poured water from a clay jug into 2 tin cups and handed one to Jonas. "What happened?" Caleb asked. "Found a cross carved into a tree at my property line," Jonas said. "Day before yesterday." Caleb's jaw tightened. He set down his cup. "Hell. Tell me what's going on." For a moment, Caleb didn't speak. He stared at the dirt floor, working his jaw like he was chewing something bitter. Then he looked up. "The Klan's reorganizing," he said quietly, "under Reverend Dunley." Jonas felt his stomach drop. "Dunley. Your old master." "Yeah." Caleb's voice was flat. "He's been preaching every Sunday about restoration, about how the South needs to remember its honor, how freedmen need to be taught their place." He paused. "They've been riding at night, burning crosses, beating folks who they say got too uppity." "Who's they?" "Started with maybe 5 or 6 men. Now it's more. Maybe 20. Could be 30. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. "They wear hoods. Call themselves the Knights of the White Camellia. But everyone knows it's just Klan by another name." Jonas's hands clenched into fists. "The sheriff looks the other way. Some say he's one of them." Caleb leaned forward. "And there's something else. Dunley's son, Thomas. What about him? He's been—" Caleb stopped, breathed out hard. "He's been forcing himself on freed women. Everyone knows it. 3 women so far, maybe more, who won't talk. Sheriff won't do nothing. Won't even take reports." The rage that rose in Jonas was cold and heavy, like iron settling in his chest. "Names," he said. "Who were the women?" "Jonas, don't—" "Names." Caleb shook his head. "They won't speak. Too scared. Thomas Dunley walks around town like he owns it, and his daddy preaches about purity and God's order. His voice turned bitter. That's the world we're living in, brother. Same as before the war, just with different words. Jonas stood. The chair scraped against the floor. Where are you going? Caleb asked. Home. Jonas. Caleb grabbed his arm. Keep your family close. Don't go anywhere alone. And if they come for you, he stopped. If they come, you run. You hear me? Don't try to fight. Just run. Jonas looked at his friend, at the worry carved deep into his face. I'll be careful. That ain't what I said. I know. He left the forge and rode home. The sun climbed higher as he traveled, burning off the mist. By the time he reached his property, the day had turned hot and still. Jonas pulled the mare to a stop in front of his cabin. Something was wrong. He could feel it before he saw it. The front door. There was a mark on it. He dismounted slowly and walked closer. His boots made soft sounds on the packed earth. Someone had carved into the wood a crude cross, just like the one on the tree. But beneath it, they had cut 9 deep notches, 9 lines, deliberate and precise. Jonas stood there staring at the symbol. His hand came up and traced the carvings. The wood was still fresh. This had been done today, while he was gone. Behind him, the door opened. Eliza stood in the doorway. She had seen it. Her face had gone pale, but she didn't speak. She just stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. They stood together in silence. The heat pressed down. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, the promise of a storm that might never come. And from the creek, the frogs began their croaking, louder and louder, filling the stillness with their endless chorus. 2 nights later, the rain came. It started as a whisper against the roof, then grew heavier. Water dripped through a crack near the chimney, making soft pinging sounds in the tin bucket Jonas had placed beneath it. Thunder rolled through the forest, low and long, like the earth itself was groaning. Jonas sat at the table, working a whetstone along the edge of his axe. The steel rang softly with each stroke, back and forth. The rhythm was steady, methodical. He'd sharpened this axe 100 times before, but tonight his hands needed something to do, something to keep them from shaking. Across the room, Eliza knelt beside Ruth's bed. Her lips moved in silent prayer. The words were too quiet to hear over the rain, but Jonas knew them anyway. He'd heard her pray these same words every night since they'd found the carved cross on their door. Protect us, Lord. Deliver us from evil. Keep our family safe. Ruth slept peacefully, clutching her doll. Her small chest rose and fell with each breath. She looked so tiny beneath the quilt, so fragile. Jonas's jaw tightened as he drew the whetstone along the blade again. 9 notches. 9 men. He'd checked the windows 3 times already tonight. Made sure the door was barred. Earlier, while the sun still hung in the sky, he'd taken every lamp in the house and poured the oil along the path leading to the cabin. The rain would wash some of it away, but not all. Not enough to matter. If they came, they'd find he'd prepared for them. Lightning flashed outside, turning the windows white for an instant. Thunder followed, closer this time. The storm was moving in. Jonas set down the whetstone and tested the axe's edge with his thumb. Sharp enough to split a hair. Sharp enough for what might need doing. Jonas, Eliza whispered. He looked up. She was standing now, her hands clasped in front of her. They're not coming, she said. Not in this rain. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to think that men driven by hate might still have sense enough to stay dry. But he'd learned long ago that hate didn't care about comfort. Hate came when it was ready. Weather be damned. Maybe, he said. Eliza crossed the room and sat beside him. She took his hand, the one that wasn't holding the axe, and squeezed it gently. If they come, she said, we run, like Caleb said. We take Ruth, and we run into the swamp where they can't follow. Jonas looked at her, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide, at the strength she carried anyway, even when that fear threatened to break her. "If we keep running," he said quietly, "Ruth will never learn to stand. If we stay, and you die, she'll never learn anything at all." He didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The thunder grew more distant. Jonas began to think that maybe Eliza was right. Maybe they'd have one more night of peace. Then, somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, a horse whinnied. Jonas's entire body went rigid. He stood so fast the chair scraped backward across the floor. Another whinny, then another. Too many horses for travelers, too many hooves striking mud. "Eliza," he said. His voice was calm, but his heart hammered against his ribs. "Take Ruth. Get into the root cellar. Bar it from inside. Jonas! Now!" She didn't argue. She moved quickly, scooping Ruth up from the bed. The girl stirred but didn't wake, her head lolling against her mother's shoulder. Eliza carried her to the corner of the cabin, where the cellar door lay hidden beneath a rug. She pulled it open and descended into the darkness below. Jonas waited until he heard the bar slide into place. Then he turned to face the door. Outside, torchlight cut through the rain. Orange flames sputtered and hissed in the downpour, but they burned anyway. 9 torches, maybe more. They came closer, the light dancing across the trees. Voices rose above the storm, shouting, cursing. Words Jonas had heard before, slurs meant to strip away humanity, to make a man into something less than human. Then one voice rose above the others, loud and righteous and filled with fury. "Jonas Clay! You come out here, you murdering devil! Reverend Dunley!" Jonas's hands tightened around the axe handle. His old master's voice, a voice he'd hoped never to hear again. "You killed my boy!" Dunley screamed. "You killed Thomas! You'll hang for it, giant! You'll hang before sunrise!" Jonas froze. Thomas? Dead? He hadn't seen Thomas Dunley in weeks, hadn't spoken to him, hadn't even crossed his path in town. What was the Reverend talking about? "I didn't kill anyone," Jonas shouted back. "Liar! We found him in the swamp, hung by his own reins, and everyone knows you're the only man strong enough to do it." The mob roared in agreement. Boots splashed through mud. Horses snorted and stamped. "Come out here and face justice," Dunley bellowed, "or we'll burn you out like the rat you are." Jonas stepped back from the door. His mind raced. This was a lie. Had to be. Thomas Dunley had been alive 2 days ago. Caleb had said so himself. But lies didn't matter to men who'd already decided on guilt. A torch sailed through the air and landed on the porch. Flames spread across the wet wood, sputtering but catching. Another torch followed. Then another. They were going to burn him alive. Jonas moved fast. He grabbed the water bucket and doused the flames nearest the door. But more torches kept coming. The men were spreading out, surrounding the cabin. In minutes, the whole place would be an inferno. His war training took over. Panic was death. Confusion was death. But preparation was survival. He'd poured the lamp oil for a reason. Jonas yanked open the door and stepped out into the rain. The torchlight blinded him for a moment, but he didn't need to see clearly. He could hear them. 9 men, maybe 10. Their boots squelching in mud, their voices rising in bloodthirsty shouts. "There he is! Get him!" Someone raised a rifle. Jonas dove sideways as the shot cracked through the air. The bullet splintered wood behind him. Then the oil caught. The path leading to the cabin erupted in flames. Fire raced along the ground in both directions, creating a wall of heat and light. The horses screamed and reared. Men shouted in confusion. Jonas moved through the chaos like a ghost. He knew this land, knew every tree, every depression in the ground. The Klansmen didn't. One man stumbled backward, his torch falling into the oil. His robes caught fire. He screamed and ran, spreading flames to the man beside him. Jonas swung the axe. The blade caught another man across the chest. He went down without a sound. Gunshots rang out. Wild, panicked. One bullet struck a horse. Another hit one of their own, a man in a hood who'd gotten turned around in the smoke. Jonas kept moving. His axe rose and fell. A fist to a jaw. A boot to a knee. Men fell in the mud and didn't get up. The rain poured harder now, turning the ground into a slick nightmare. A rider tried to charge through the flames, but his horse balked. The animal reared, throwing him. His head struck a tree root with a wet crack. More gunfire. More screaming. The smell of burning cloth and flesh mixed with smoke and rain. Jonas fought like the war had never ended. Like every skill he'd learned digging trenches and building bridges under fire had been preparing him for this exact moment. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The rain extinguished the last of the flames. Smoke rose in gray columns. Jonas stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, axe hanging from one hand. Bodies lay scattered in the mud. Some burned, some broken, all still. 9 men, just like the notches on his door. The cellar door creaked open. Eliza emerged, clutching Ruth tight against her chest. They were both shaking. Ruth was awake now, her eyes wide with terror. Jonas dropped the axe. He fell to his knees in the mud, staring at his hands, blood mixed with rain, running in dark streams down his fingers. "It's done," he muttered. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating his face. For one brilliant moment, he looked carved from stone. Immovable, inevitable. Dawn broke gray and cold. Smoke still rose from the swamp in thin ribbons, twisting through the pine trees like ghosts. Jonas stood beside an old wagon he'd dragged from the barn, its wheels caked in dried mud. The bodies lay where they'd fallen, rain-soaked and broken. Some had their faces still hidden beneath white hoods. Others stared at nothing with wide, empty eyes. He began loading them, one by one. The first body was the lightest. A young man, maybe 20, who'd caught the axe across his ribs. Jonas lifted him by the shoulders and legs, setting him in the wagon bed with more care than the man had shown when he'd come with torch and rope. The second body was heavier, burned. The smell made Jonas's stomach turn, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Eliza stepped out, Ruth clinging to her skirts. The little girl's eyes were red from crying. She'd seen too much, heard too much. Things no child should ever witness. "Jonas," Eliza said. Her voice cracked. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer, just kept loading. The third body, the fourth. His muscles burned. His hands trembled, but he kept moving. "Jonas, please!" Eliza walked closer, Ruth's hand tight in hers. "Leave them. We have to run, right now, before anyone comes looking." He lifted the fifth body, Reverend Dunley's brother, judging by the silver watch chain still hanging from his vest pocket. Jonas laid him in the wagon next to the others. "If we run, they'll hunt us," he said quietly. "They'll burn every freedman's home between here and the state line looking for us. They'll hang folks just for knowing our names. Then we go north. We cross into Tennessee. They'll kill us all." Jonas turned to face her. His eyes were hollow, ancient. "Every black soul in this county will pay for what I did, unless I make them see." Eliza's breath hitched. "See what?" "What they made. The sixth body. The seventh." The wagon groaned under the weight. Ruth buried her face in her mother's dress. Eliza's hands shook as she stroked the girl's hair, trying to shield her from the sight. But there was no shield strong enough, no word soft enough to undo what had already been carved into this morning. Jonas loaded the eighth body, then the ninth. Reverend Dunley himself lay at the top of the pile, his hood pulled back to reveal his face, eyes open, mouth frozen in a scream he'd never finished. Jonas secured the wagon's gate and wiped his hands on his pants. Blood and mud smeared across the fabric. He looked at Eliza, at Ruth, at the only two people in the world who still saw him as more than a monster. "Stay here," he said. "Bar the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." "Jonas, no! I'll be back before noon." He climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. The old mule hitched to the front, stamped nervously, smelling death. Jonas clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, wheels squelching through mud. Eliza watched him go. She held Ruth tight against her chest, both of them standing in the smoky dawn like statues, like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. The road into town was quiet, too quiet. Birds didn't sing, insects didn't hum, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jonas passed the first freedman's homestead just after sunrise. Old Samuel Martin stood in his yard, chopping wood. He looked up at the sound of the wagon. His eyes widened. The axe slipped from his hands. "Lord have mercy," Samuel whispered. Jonas kept driving. Word spread faster than fire. By the time he reached the edge of town, people lined the road. Black faces, mostly. Men and women who'd known slavery, who'd tasted freedom and learned it was just another kind of cage. They stared at the wagon, at the bodies piled high, at Jonas, sitting tall on the driver's seat, his face carved from stone. Someone whispered his name, then another, then a dozen voices, soft as prayer. The giant. Jonas Clay. He'd done it. He really done it. A woman clutched a child to her chest and made the sign of the cross. An old man removed his hat and bowed his head. They didn't cheer, didn't celebrate, but something passed through them, something like awe mixed with terror. The kind of feeling you get standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down. Jonas didn't acknowledge them, just kept the mule moving forward. The white church sat at the center of town, its steeple rising above the general store and the sheriff's office. Sunday morning services had already started. Hymns drifted through the open doors, voices raised in praise. Jonas stopped the wagon directly in front of the steps. Inside, Reverend Dunley, no, not Dunley, he was dead in the wagon. Someone else stood at the pulpit, a visiting preacher, thin and sharp-voiced, preaching fire and brimstone. "And the Lord shall smite the unholy," the preacher shouted. "He shall cast down the wicked and raise up the righteous. For God's judgment is swift, and his justice is—" The church doors banged open. Jonas stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun. 7 feet of shadow and silence. The congregation turned. Women gasped. Men half rose from their seats. The preacher's voice died in his throat. Jonas walked down the center aisle. His boots echoed on the wooden floor. Blood still stained his shirt. Mud caked his pants. He looked like something dragged up from the earth itself. He stopped at the pulpit, looked at the preacher, looked at the congregation. White faces frozen in shock and dawning horror. Then he turned and walked back outside. The first body hit the church steps with a wet thud. The second, the third. Jonas unloaded them one by one, laying them out in a row like offerings at an altar. The congregation poured out of the church, stumbling over each other. Screams erupted. A woman fainted. A man vomited into the dirt. Jonas laid down the 9th body, Reverend Dunley, still wearing his Klan robes, and straightened. He looked at the crowd, at the horror and rage and fear twisting their faces. "Your men came for judgment," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "I just made it quick." Silence. Then chaos. Shouting. Cursing. Someone ran for the sheriff's office. Women herded children away from the site. Men stood frozen, staring at the bodies, trying to recognize faces beneath the blood and mud. Jonas climbed back onto the wagon, took up the reins, turned the mule around. He drove out of town the same way he'd come in, slow and deliberate, while the world collapsed behind him. By the time he reached home, the sun was high. Eliza met him at the door, her face pale. She'd heard. Everyone had heard. Jonas unhitched the mule and led it to the barn. He moved like a man underwater, each motion slow and heavy. When he came back inside, Eliza had set out food. Cornbread, beans, water. They sat at the table in silence. Ruth picked at her food, her small hands shaking. She kept glancing at her father, then looking away, like she was afraid of what she might see. Jonas ate without tasting. His mind was elsewhere. In town, in the swamp, in the war that had never really ended. Outside, the sun moved across the sky. Afternoon stretched into evening. The cabin grew dim. Then, as darkness settled over the pines, the dogs started barking, far off at first, then closer, coming from town. Eliza's hand found Jonas's across the table. She squeezed it tight. Ruth looked up, her eyes wide. The owls began to cry. Long, mournful calls that echoed through the trees. Jonas sat very still, listening, waiting. The weight of what was coming pressed down on them all. 3 days after the bodies appeared on the church steps, a lone rider entered town from the north. He wore a dusty gray coat and a federal badge pinned to his chest. His horse looked tired. So did he. Marshal Henry Worth was 43 years old and carried the war in his bones. He'd fought at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, at places whose names he tried to forget. He'd commanded colored troops in the final year. Good men who'd saved his life more than once. Men the government had promised freedom, and then abandoned to wolves. He stopped his horse outside the white church and dismounted. The building looked the same as any other country church, except for the dark stains on the steps. Someone had tried to scrub them clean. They'd failed. Wirth crouched down, running his fingers over the wood. 9 men. 9 bodies laid out like a message written in flesh. Sheriff Roy Wills approached from the office across the street. He was thin and sharp-featured, with cold eyes that never quite looked at you straight. "Marshal," Wills said, extending his hand. Worth shook it without enthusiasm. "Sheriff, appreciate you coming so quick. This whole business has the town on edge. I'm sure it does." Worth stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Tell me what happened." Wills launched into his version. Jonas Clay, a dangerous slave who'd terrorized the county since the war ended. How he'd murdered Reverend Dunley's son weeks ago and gotten away with it. How 9 upstanding citizens had gone to serve a warrant and been slaughtered like animals. Worth listened without interrupting. He'd heard stories like this before. The details changed, but the shape stayed the same. "Where's the body?" Worth asked. "Dunley's son." Wills blinked. "What? You said Clay murdered him weeks ago. Where's the body?" "Buried. Out at the family plot. I'll need to see it." Wills's jaw tightened. "That's private property. The family's grieving." "Then they can grieve while I do my job." Worth turned toward his horse. "I'll need statements from witnesses. Anyone who saw what happened that night." Nobody saw nothing. It was dark. "Out in the swamp." "Then I'll need to see the site. Can't get there by horse. Too muddy." Worth stopped and looked back at the sheriff. "You trying to help me do my job, Sheriff? Or make it harder?" Wills's expression went flat. "Just stating facts, Marshal. This county's been through hell. We don't need some northerners stirring up." "I fought for the Union," Worth interrupted quietly, "alongside men who looked like Jonas Clay. Good men. Brave men. So when you talk about northerners, remember who won the war." Silence hung between them. Wills's hand drifted toward his belt, then stopped. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Course, Marshal. Didn't mean nothing by it." "I'm sure you didn't." Worth mounted his horse. "I'll be at the Clay property if you need me." He rode out of town before Wills could respond. The Clay homestead sat in a clearing 2 miles outside town. surrounded by pine forest and Spanish moss, or what was left of it. The cabin was gone, burned down to charred beams and ash. The garden was trampled, the barn half collapsed. Worth dismounted and walked the property slowly. His trained eye picked out details: hoof prints, burned torch remnants, spent shell casings. 9 men had come here. That much was clear. But the ground told a different story than Wills's version. Near the tree line, Worth found disturbed earth, freshly turned soil where something had been buried. He dug with his hands until he uncovered burned wood and metal, the remains of traps. Clever ones, the kind an engineer would build. Behind the ruined barn, he found 3 graves. Small wooden crosses marked them. He knelt and read the names carved into the wood. Horses. Jonas had buried the animals killed in the fighting. A man who buried horses wasn't the monster Wills described. Worth stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. An old black man approached slowly, hat in hand. His face was lined with age and caution. "Help you?" Worth asked. "Name's Samuel Martin, sir. Live down the road a piece. You know Jonas Clay?" Samuel hesitated. "Know of him. Did you see what happened here 3 nights ago?" "Didn't see nothing. Was home with my wife." Worth studied him. "But you heard something." Samuel looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "Heard horses. Heard shouting. Heard guns." He paused. "Heard screaming." "Who's screaming?" "White men, mostly." "Mostly?" Samuel met Worth's eyes for the first time. "Reverend Dunley. He used to own Jonas, back before the war. Worked him near to death in the fields. Beat him for reading, for looking folks in the eye, for being too tall." He swallowed. "Dunley's son was worse. He hurt women. Black women. Everyone knew. Sheriff didn't care." "You're saying Thomas Dunley assaulted freed women?" "I'm saying there's girls in this county who won't go near town no more. Girls who wake up screaming." Samuel's voice hardened. "And I'm saying Jonas Clay never touched that boy. Wouldn't have needed to. Devil takes his own, eventually." Worth nodded slowly. "Where is Jonas now?" "Don't know. Don't want to know." Samuel put his hat back on. "But if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. Or anyone. That man's earned his peace." He walked away, leaving Worth alone among the ruins. Deep in the swamp, 3 miles from any road, Jonas sat watching the fire. It was small, just enough to cook fish and keep the mosquitoes back. Too much smoke would draw attention. Ruth slept on a bed of pine needles, wrapped in Eliza's shawl. Eliza sat beside Jonas, mending a tear in his shirt with thread she'd saved from the cabin. They'd been here 3 days. 3 days of hiding like animals, drinking swamp water, eating whatever Jonas could catch or kill. Ruth cried herself to sleep every night, asking when they could go home. There was no home to go back to. Jonas stood and walked to the edge of their camp. The swamp stretched out in all directions, water and shadows, and the sounds of things moving in the dark. He knew this place, had hidden here during the war when Confederate patrols came through. The swamp kept secrets, but it couldn't keep them forever. "Jonas?" Eliza's voice was soft. "Come sit." He didn't move. "They'll find us. Maybe, maybe not. They will." He turned to look at her. "Question is what happens when they do." Eliza set down her sewing. "Then we run farther." "How far? Tennessee? Ohio? You think they'll let us go?" Jonas shook his head. "We're marked now. I'm marked. Everywhere I go, I bring death with me." "Don't talk like that." "It's the truth." Eliza stood and walked to him. She took his hand, the same hand that had killed 9 men 3 nights ago. She held it gently, like it was something precious. "You protected us," she said. "That's all you did. Protected your family." "I killed them, Eliza. I killed them, and I left their bodies on church steps like a warning." Her eyes were fierce. "Like a promise that we won't die quiet." that we matter. She squeezed his hand. You think they would have let us live if you'd just stood there and taken it? Jonas didn't answer. In the distance, faint and far off, a sound drifted through the trees, singing. The melody was old, older than the war, older than freedom. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Jonas went very still. Eliza heard it too. They both listened. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. The song moved through the swamp like wind, carried from throat to throat, homestead to homestead. It was a message, a warning. The clan was regrouping. Jonas's hand found his axe, leaning against a nearby cypress. His fingers wrapped around the handle, knuckles white. Eliza watched him, said nothing. The singing faded into the night, leaving only the sound of frogs and the crackle of their small fire. The morning came gray and cold. Mist hung over the swamp like wet cloth, muffling sound and turning the world into shadows. Worth rode into town as shopkeepers swept their porches and dogs stretched in the dirt roads. He found Caleb Turner's forge at the edge of the colored district. The building was simple, weathered wood, and a tin roof that pinged with condensation. Inside, the heat hit him like a wall. Caleb worked the bellows, his face sheened with sweat, muscles moving under his shirt as he hammered red-hot iron into shape. He didn't look up when Worth entered. Shops closed to white folks today. I'm not here to buy. Worth removed his hat. I'm Marshal Henry Worth. I need to ask you about Jonas Clay. Caleb's hammer stopped mid-swing. He turned slowly, taking in Worth's dusty travel clothes, his worn boots, the service revolver at his hip. His eyes were sharp and untrusting. Don't know nobody by that name. Yes, you do. Worth stepped closer. You served together. Union sappers. Vicksburg campaign. Caleb's jaw worked. He set the hammer down and wiped his hands on a rag. Even if I did, why would I tell you? Because I'm trying to help him. Help him? Caleb laughed without humor. You're here to arrest him. Hang him. Make an example. I'm here to find the truth. Truth don't matter to men like you. Only thing that matters is keeping white folks happy. Worth met his eyes steadily. I fought alongside colored soldiers, buried them, watched them die for a country that didn't give a damn about them. His voice was quiet. I know what the truth costs. Caleb studied him for a long moment. Then he walked to a shelf cluttered with tools and iron scraps. He pulled down a small wooden box and opened it. Inside were papers, letters, a few coins. He removed a photograph, faded and bent at the corners, and handed it to Worth. Took this outside Vicksburg. Summer of '63. Worth looked at the image. A group of Union soldiers stood in front of a half-built pontoon bridge. 12 men, black and white together, covered in mud and exhaustion. In the back row, towering over everyone, stood Jonas Clay. His expression was serious, distant, and standing beside him, one hand on the bridge railing, was a younger Henry Worth. Recognition hit him like cold water. He remembered that day. The heat, the Confederate shelling that had lasted for hours, the bridge they'd built under fire, knowing any moment could be their last. He remembered the tall sapper who'd worked twice as fast as anyone else, who'd carried wounded men across his shoulders when the retreat came. He remembered Jonas. Jesus, Worth breathed. You were there. Caleb's voice was softer now. I was. Worth traced Jonas's face in the photograph. I didn't recognize him. It's been 9 years. Caleb took the photo back carefully. War changes a man. Freedom changes him more. He put it back in the box. Jonas saved my life at Shiloh. Carried me 2 miles with a bullet in my leg. Never asked for thanks. Never asked for nothing. Worth was quiet for a moment. Where is he now? Don't know. Don't want to know. Caleb, listen to me, Marshal. Caleb's voice was hard. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever truth you think you're chasing, it won't matter. They'll kill him anyway. They'll kill his wife, his little girl, and they'll sleep fine afterward." He crossed his arms. "So unless you plan to put a bullet in Reverend Dunley's head yourself, there ain't nothing you can do." Worth nodded slowly. He placed his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the photograph." He left the forge as Caleb returned to his work, the hammer ringing against iron like a church bell. That evening, Worth rode out to the Dunley estate. It sat on a hill overlooking the town, a plantation house that had survived the war intact, its white columns gleaming in the fading light. The grounds were immaculate. Slaves had tended them once. Now freedmen did the same work for wages that barely bought bread. Reverend Dunley greeted him on the porch, all warmth and hospitality. "Marshal Worth, what an honor. Please, come in." The interior was lavish. Imported furniture, oil paintings, a chandelier that caught the lamplight and scattered it like stars. Dunley poured whiskey from a crystal decanter and settled into a leather chair. "I assume you're here about the unfortunate business with the slave." "Jonas Clay." Worth sipped his whiskey. It was expensive. Too expensive for a preacher's salary. "I'm trying to understand what happened." "What happened?" Dunley's face darkened. "That animal murdered my son. Murdered 9 good Christian men who went to serve justice. And now he's hiding in the swamp like the coward he is. Tell me about your son." Dunley's expression softened into grief. "Thomas was a light in this world. Faithful, kind. He worked the land alongside our people, treated them with respect. He drank deeply. When that monster killed him, it broke something in this community. We'd tried to live in peace with the coloreds, but they showed us their true nature." Worth nodded, his face neutral. "How did Thomas die?" "Strangled. Left hanging in the swamp like—" Dunley's voice cracked. "Like an animal. When did you find the body?" 3 weeks ago." "And you buried him where?" "Family plot, behind the house." Worth set down his glass. "I'd like to see the grave." Dunley's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Standard procedure. I need to verify." "You calling me a liar, Marshal?" "I'm doing my job." Silence stretched between them. Dunley's hand trembled slightly as he poured himself more whiskey. He drank it fast. Too fast. "My son was a good boy." His voice was thick now, slurred at the edges. He had troubles, weaknesses, but he was good. "What kind of troubles?" Dunley didn't answer right away. The whiskey was working on him, loosening the careful control he maintained in public. He liked colored girls, couldn't help himself. I told him it was sin, told him the devil was in his blood. He laughed bitterly. "But you can't beat the devil out." "I tried." Worth went very still. "You beat your son?" "Tried to save him. Discipline. Scripture. Nothing worked." Dunley's eyes were distant now, lost in memory. One night he came home drunk, had his hands on one of the girls again. Housemaid. She was crying, bleeding. I told him to stop. He laughed at me, called me weak, called me— His voice broke. I hit him. Just meant to knock sense into him, but he fell. Hit his head on the hearth. Dunley stared at his hands. He was dead before I could call for help. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Worth's voice was careful. "When did this happen?" "Years ago, during the war." "But you said—" "I said what I needed to say." Dunley's face flushed red. "That slave needed to pay. They all need to pay. They came here with their freedom and their arrogance, thinking they're equal, thinking they're—" He stopped, seeming to realize what he'd confessed. Worth stood slowly. "Thank you for the whiskey, Reverend." "You can't tell anyone." "I'm a federal marshal. I have to report—" "You report nothing." Dunley stood, swaying slightly. "This is my county, my people. You Northerners come down here thinking you know better, but you don't understand what we lost, what they took from us." Worth walked to the door. Dunley followed, his voice rising. "I'm rebuilding order here. Righteous order. God's order. And no drunk marshal with slave sympathies is going to stop me. Worth turned at the threshold. I'll be filing my report tomorrow. The truth will come out. He left Dunley standing in the doorway, whiskey glass in hand, face twisted with rage and fear. Back at his room above the general store, Worth sat at a small desk and wrote everything down. Every word of Dunley's confession. Every detail. He sealed the report in an envelope and addressed it to the federal district office in Jackson. At dawn, he'd ride to the telegraph office and send it north. He lay down on the narrow bed, fully clothed, his revolver on the nightstand. He didn't hear Sheriff Wills enter through the window until it was too late. The sheriff moved fast for a man his age. He had Worth's gun before the marshal could react, pressing it against his temple. "Real sorry about this," Wills said quietly, "but you should have minded your own business." He took the sealed envelope from the desk, read the address, and smiled. Then he walked to the small stove in the corner and fed the report to the flames. Worth watched his evidence turn to ash. "Reverend Dunley's a good man," Wills said, "doing God's work. And I won't have some Yankee troublemaker destroying what we're building here." He backed toward the window, keeping the gun trained on Worth. "Stay in this room till sunrise. You try to leave, you try to send any messages, and I'll kill you. Understand?" Worth didn't answer. Wills climbed out the window and disappeared into the night. By evening, word had spread. Dunley gathered his men in the church basement. 20 hooded figures, white robes ghostly in the lamplight. "The marshal knows too much," Dunley said. "But we can use that. We take the woman. Use her to draw the giant out. He'll come for her. And when he does, we end this." The men murmured agreement. They rode at midnight. In the swamp, Ruth woke to shouting. She heard horses. Torchlight flickered through the gaps in the floorboards. Her mother was screaming. "Under here, baby," Eliza whispered urgently, lifting a loose board. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Ruth crawled into the space beneath the floor. Eliza replaced the board just as the door crashed open. Men in white hoods filled the cabin. Ruth watched through the gaps as they grabbed her mother. Eliza fought, clawing at their faces, but there were too many. "Where's your husband?" one demanded. "I don't know." They hit her. Ruth bit her hand to keep from crying out. "Tell us, or we kill the girl." "She's not here. Please, she's just a child." They dragged Eliza outside. Ruth heard hooves, her mother's screams growing fainter. Then silence. She stayed under the floor, trembling, alone. When Jonas returned an hour later, the cabin was empty. He found Ruth huddled in the darkness, her eyes wide with terror. "Mama," she whispered. "They took Mama." Jonas knelt beside her, his huge hands gentle as he pulled her close. Through the trees, faint and terrible, he heard Eliza's voice crying out his name. The sound cut through him like a blade. He stood, his shadow filling the small cabin, and for the first time since the war ended, Jonas Clay felt something break inside him that would never heal. The smoke rose from the town square at dawn. Jonas saw it from the hill where he'd been watching all night. Ruth had finally fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted from crying. He held her carefully. His massive frame curved around her small body like a shield. The smoke was wrong. Too controlled. Too deliberate. He knew what it meant. He carried Ruth deeper into the swamp, to where Caleb Turner had hidden with his own family. The blacksmith took the child without questions, his wife wrapping her in a quilt. Ruth reached for Jonas, her small hand grasping at air. "Papa!" "I'll be back," he lied. Then he walked toward town. The congregation gathered in the square. Not in the church. Reverend Dunley wanted witnesses. He wanted the whole county to see. Eliza hung from the oak tree that had once shaded market days. Her body turned slowly in the morning wind. Someone had dressed her in white cloth, tied around her neck, draping down like a mockery of angel wings. Purity reclaimed! Dunley called out from beneath the tree. His voice carried across the silent crowd. This woman was complicit in her husband's sins. She sheltered a murderer. She raised a devil's child. But in death, we grant her what she denied in life: redemption through suffering. The white faces in the crowd nodded, murmured amens. The black faces stood further back, eyes down, hands clutched together. Some women wept silently. Men stared at the ground, jaws tight. Marshal Worth pushed through the crowd, his face pale. He'd been held at gunpoint until sunrise, released only when it was too late to stop this. "Cut her down," he demanded. Dunley smiled. "By whose authority?" "Mine. Federal law. Doesn't apply to criminals. She wasn't tried. There was no jury. No. We are the jury." Dunley gestured to the crowd. "Christian people of this county. We judged. We found her guilty. Justice is served." Worth's hand moved toward his revolver. Sheriff Wills stepped forward, his own gun already drawn. "I wouldn't." The marshal's hand stopped. Dunley continued his sermon, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. He spoke of cleansing, of righteous fury, of God's judgment upon the wicked. The crowd swayed with his words, caught in the rhythm of hate disguised as holiness. Worth backed away slowly, sick to his stomach. He'd seen death before. War had shown him every kind of horror. But this calculated cruelty, this performance of evil dressed in Sunday clothes, it was something worse than battle. This was murder celebrated. He walked to his horse, intending to ride to Jackson immediately, to bring federal troops to end this. But as he mounted, he saw movement on the distant hill, a figure standing alone, too tall to be anyone else: Jonas. On the hill, Jonas watched until the crowd dispersed. Watched as they left Eliza hanging there, a warning to anyone who might resist. Watched as Dunley lingered beneath the tree, speaking to his closest followers, planning their next move. His tears had stopped. Something inside him had broken last night, when he heard Eliza scream. Something that had held him together through slavery, through war, through every humiliation and horror. The part of him that believed patience and dignity would eventually win. That part was dead now. He walked back to the swamp, to the place where he'd buried his past. The Union uniform was wrapped in oilcloth, protected from rot. He'd sworn never to wear it again. The war had made him into something terrible, a weapon pointed at other men. He'd wanted to be human again, a husband, a father, but they wouldn't let him. He pulled on the wool jacket, stained and faded, but still intact. The brass buttons caught the morning light. He found his old insignia, the sapper's crossed picks, and pressed it into his palm until it left an impression. Ruth appeared in the doorway of Caleb's shelter, her small face streaked with tears. "Papa?" He knelt before her, still holding the insignia. "I have to go away for a while." "To get Mama?" His throat closed. He couldn't speak. "She's coming back, right?" Ruth's voice was so small, so full of hope it hurt worse than any wound. "Like you always come back?" Jonas pulled her close, pressing his face against her hair. "You stay with Caleb. You be good. You remember what Mama taught you about reading? About everything." He held her tighter. "About being strong. About not letting them make you small. I don't understand." "You will." He released her gently. "Now go inside." She obeyed, looking back once before Caleb's wife ushered her away. Jonas stood, the uniform heavy on his shoulders, not from weight, but from memory, from all the things he'd done wearing it, all the bridges he'd built under fire, all the tunnels he'd dug beneath enemy lines, all the death. Caleb emerged from the shelter, his expression grim. "They're saying she suffered, that Dunley made it last." Jonas said nothing. "You going into town?" "Yes." "They'll kill you." "They'll try." Caleb disappeared into his workshop, returning with a whetstone. He gestured to Jonas's axe. "Let me sharpen it proper." While the blacksmith worked the blade, Jonas cleaned his revolver, a weapon he'd taken from a Confederate officer during the war. 6 shots. He checked each chamber carefully. Caleb tested the axe edge with his thumb. "Sharp enough to split hair." "Good." "Jonas," the blacksmith's voice was quiet. "What you did to those 9 men, that was war. What you're about to do, that's something else. I know. Once you cross this line, there's no coming back." Jonas took the axe. "I crossed that line the moment they put a rope around her neck." Worth found him an hour later, as sunset painted the swamp red. The marshal's horse splashed through shallow water, stopping where Jonas sat on a fallen log, sharpening his axe one final time. "Don't do this," Worth said. Jonas didn't look up. "You were too late." "I was held." "I know. Sheriff told you to stay put. And you did." The scrape of stone on metal filled the silence. "That's the difference between us. Jonas, listen to me. I can bring federal troops. Real justice. We can. Your justice is slow. Mine is fast. This isn't justice. It's vengeance." Jonas finally looked up. His eyes were empty of everything except purpose. "You call it vengeance. I call it balance." He stood, axe over his shoulder. The uniform stretched across his massive frame, buttons straining. He looked like something from a nightmare, a ghost of the war risen from the mud. Worth dismounted. "They'll hang you. They'll make an example. They already did." Jonas gestured toward town. "Her body's still swinging. That's their example." He started walking. "Now they'll see mine. You'll die. Already dead." Jonas didn't turn around. "Been dead since I heard her scream." The marshal watched him disappear into the darkening forest. He considered following, considered trying to stop him, but he'd seen that look before. On soldiers who'd lost everything. On men who'd decided dying was easier than living. Instead, he rode toward Jackson. If he couldn't prevent the massacre, he could at least document. The church bell began tolling as Jonas entered the empty road leading to town. Midnight. Each ring cut through the warm night air, counting down to something inevitable. The moon hung full and pale above him. Its light caught on the scars covering his face. Scars from whips, from shrapnel, from a lifetime of violence he'd never chosen. Behind him, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Lightning flickered silently in the distance, illuminating the road ahead in brief, terrible flashes. He walked alone. His shadow stretched before him, impossibly long in the moonlight. Each step deliberate, each breath measured. No running, no hiding, no more. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, the kind of day that made people believe in divine favor. The church bells rang out their cheerful summons across Clay County, calling the faithful to worship. Inside the white clapboard church, every pew was filled. Women in their finest dresses fanned themselves against the heat. Men stood along the walls when the seats ran out. Children fidgeted in the aisles. The congregation had swelled to twice its normal size. Everyone wanted to hear Reverend Dunley's sermon after yesterday's righteous act. Dunley stood at the pulpit, resplendent in his black suit and silver-buttoned vest. His white hair was combed back, his face flushed with the fervor of a man who believed every word he spoke. "Brothers and sisters," his voice boomed through the sanctuary. Yesterday, God himself delivered judgment upon the sinner's wife. Amens rippled through the crowd. She who harbored evil, she who raised a demon child, she who stood beside a murderer and called it marriage. He slammed his palm on the pulpit. The Lord saw fit to deliver her unto us, and we faithful servants, enacted his divine will. More amens, louder this time. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes, overcome with emotion. "Some may question our methods." Dunley's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some may say we acted without mercy, But I ask you, did our Lord show mercy to Sodom? Did he spare Gomorrah? No. He purged them with holy fire, cleansing the earth of corruption. The congregation leaned forward, hanging on every word. And so we too must cleanse. We must purify. We must— Outside, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted his sermon. Dunley paused, irritated. Through the window, he could see riders in white hoods gathering in the churchyard. More of his followers, arriving late. He smiled and continued, "We must stand united against the darkness that threatens our way of life, against those who would see our children corrupted, our women defiled, our God-given order destroyed." The hoofbeats grew closer, more insistent. Then they stopped. Marshal Worth yanked his horse to a halt outside the church, his uniform soaked with sweat. He'd ridden through the night from Jackson, pushing his mount to near collapse. Federal troops were coming, but they wouldn't arrive for hours. He'd seen Jonas in the distance, walking down the main road, barefoot, alone, carrying something white in his hands. Worth dismounted, his legs nearly buckling. He stumbled toward the church doors just as Sheriff Wills blocked his path. "Service is in session," the sheriff said calmly. "You need to evacuate this building. Now." "On what grounds?" "Jonas Clay is coming." Wills smirked. "One man? Against the whole county? You don't understand what's about to—" "I understand perfectly." The sheriff gestured to the hooded riders surrounding the churchyard. "We're ready for him. Been ready since sunrise. He shows his face here. He'll be riddled with bullets before he takes 3 steps. Worth looked around at the armed men. At least 20 of them, rifles aimed at the road. Every angle covered. Every approach watched. "You're making a mistake," Worth said. Only mistake was letting him live this long. Inside the church, Dunley's voice reached a crescendo. "And so I say to you, fear not, for the righteous shall inherit the earth, and the wicked shall be cast into—" Someone screamed. A woman near the window had looked outside and seen him. Jonas walked down the center of the main street, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sun. He wore his Union uniform, the wool jacket dark with sweat. His face was painted with ash, streaked across his cheeks like war paint. In his hands, he carried Eliza's white shawl, the same cloth they'd tied around her neck. He didn't hurry, didn't run. Each step measured and deliberate, like a man walking to church. The Klansmen raised their rifles. "Fire!" Wills shouted. Gunshots cracked through the morning air. Birds exploded from the trees. Smoke filled the churchyard. But Jonas kept walking. The first volley missed completely. Panic made the shooters wild, their hands shaking. "Again!" Wills screamed. More gunfire. Louder this time. Desperate. A bullet tore through the shawl in Jonas's hands. Another sparked off the dirt near his feet. One grazed his shoulder, drawing blood, but he didn't flinch. He kept walking. Men began backing away, their rifles lowering. Some claimed later it was divine intervention. Others said their guns jammed. A few admitted the truth. They'd aimed true, but something in them couldn't pull the trigger. Couldn't kill a man who walked like judgment itself. Jonas reached the church steps. The doors stood open, and through them he could see Dunley at the pulpit, frozen mid-sermon. Could see the congregation turning to stare. Could see their faces shift from righteous certainty to primal fear. He stepped inside. "Stop him!" Dunley's voice cracked. "Shoot him!" But the men in the pews sat paralyzed. Women clutched their children. No one moved. Jonas walked down the center aisle, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He passed families who'd smiled while Eliza hung, past men who'd cheered when Dunley pronounced her guilty, past the same congregation that had called themselves righteous while they murdered an innocent woman. When he reached the pulpit, Dunley stumbled backward. "You have no right. Neither did you." Jonas reached the church doors and pulled them shut. The heavy wood boomed like thunder. He lifted the iron crossbar and dropped it into place, locking them all inside. Screams erupted. People rushed the doors, pounding against them, but the bar held firm. Dunley ran toward the side exit. Jonas caught him by the collar and threw him back toward the altar. The reverend crashed into the communion table, scattering wine and bread. "My men will burn you alive!" Dunley shrieked. Jonas picked up the oil lanterns hanging on the walls, one by one, methodical, calm. "What are you doing? Stop! Stop!" He threw the first lantern into the front pews. Glass shattered. Flames spread across the dry wood, catching the hymn books, racing up the curtains. "No! Please! God, no!" The second lantern struck the choir loft. Fire climbed the walls. People screamed, clawing at the windows, but the iron bars, installed to keep thieves out, now kept them in. Jonas threw the third lantern at the pulpit itself. Flames roared up around Dunley, who scrambled away, his fine suit smoking. "Why?" the reverend sobbed. "Why are you doing this?" Jonas looked at him. His voice was quiet beneath the roar of flames. "You built your heaven on our hell." He walked to the back doors, his figure haloed by firelight. "I'm just closing the gate." He lifted the crossbar. Outside, Worth had finally pushed past the sheriff. He ran toward the church, just as Jonas emerged through the smoke. Behind him, flames consumed everything. The screams inside grew louder, more desperate, then began to fade. "What have you done?" Worth whispered. Jonas walked past him without answering. The white shawl in his hands was now stained with soot and blood. The roof groaned. Timbers cracked. Then the entire structure collapsed inward, sending sparks spiraling into the clear morning sky. Smoke rose like a dark halo above the burning church, visible for miles, a pillar of black against the blue, announcing to the whole county that something had fundamentally changed, that the old order had burned. That judgment had finally come. The next day, Clay County smelled like a funeral pyre. Ash drifted through the streets like snow in summer. It settled on windowsills and doorsteps, coated the leaves of magnolia trees, turned the morning dew gray. People walked through town with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, coughing, unable to escape the reminder of what had burned. The church stood as a blackened skeleton. Its walls had collapsed inward, leaving only the stone foundation and a few charred support beams reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Federal marshals had arrived at dawn, cordoning off the ruins with rope and wooden posts. They moved through the debris carefully, cataloging what remained. Bodies, 23 of them. Men, women, children. All burned beyond recognition, their final moments preserved in positions of terror. Hands reaching toward windows that wouldn't open, bodies piled against doors that wouldn't budge. Marshal Worth stood at the edge of the destruction, his face gray. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jonas walking through that wall of gunfire, unstoppable as judgment itself. "Sir," one of the younger marshals approached, his voice hushed. "We've searched the entire perimeter. No sign of the perpetrator." "Keep looking." "Sir, with respect, if he was inside when the roof collapsed." "He wasn't inside. Keep looking." The marshal nodded and walked away. Worth had watched Jonas emerge from those flames, had seen him walk past, untouched by fire, carrying that white shawl. The man hadn't run, hadn't fled into the swamp or disappeared into the night. He'd simply walked away, as if his work was finished. Worth found him an hour later. The riverbank was quiet, shaded by willows that dipped their branches into the slow-moving water. Morning light filtered through the leaves, dappling everything gold and green. Birds sang their usual songs, oblivious to yesterday's horror. Jonas knelt at the water's edge. At first, Worth thought he was praying. The giant's head was bowed, his hands folded around something white. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the stillness. Then Worth saw the burns. Jonas's uniform was charred black along the back and shoulders. His hands were blistered, the skin peeling away in strips. Smoke damage had darkened his face, but his expression remained peaceful, almost serene. He was dead, kneeling like a man at prayer, clutching Eliza's shawl, facing the water where light danced on the surface. Worth stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to speak. He'd seen death before. God knows he'd seen enough death during the war. But this felt different, sacred somehow, like stumbling upon something not meant for mortal eyes. "Sir?" Another marshal had followed him down to the river. "Is that?" "Yes." "Should we?" "No." Worth's voice was firm. "Leave him be. For now." The marshal hesitated, then withdrew. Worth knelt beside Jonas, his knees sinking into the soft mud. Up close, he could see the details the distance had hidden. The way Jonas's fingers were woven through the shawl's fabric, holding it like a lifeline. The tears that had cut clean tracks through the ash on his face, the slight smile at the corners of his mouth. "You fool," Worth whispered. "You goddamn fool." But there was no anger in his voice, only grief, only understanding. Jonas had never intended to survive. This had always been the ending he'd chosen. Not escape, not freedom, but sacrifice. A final act that would burn away more than just a church. That would incinerate the lie that men like Dunley could hide behind righteousness while committing atrocities. That would show the world what it had created when it taught a man that mercy was weakness. Worth stood slowly, his joints protesting. He walked back up the riverbank and found the marshal who'd spoken earlier. "Bring a wagon. And a carpenter's blanket. The good wool, not the rough stuff." "Sir, the criminal lot is—" "He's not going in the criminal lot." "But the law states—" Worth turned, and something in his expression made the younger man step back. "The law also stated that those people in that church had the right to murder a woman without trial. The law stated that 9 men could ride out and burn a family alive without consequence." "Don't talk to me about what the law states." The marshal swallowed. "Where should we bury him?" "In the colored cemetery, next to his wife. The townspeople won't—" "The townspeople will do exactly as they're told, or I'll arrest every last one of them for conspiracy to commit murder." Worth's voice was ice. This man was a Union soldier who served his country with honor. He deserves to be buried beside his wife. Anyone who disagrees can take it up with the federal government. By afternoon, Jonas lay in a simple pine coffin beside Eliza's grave. The colored cemetery occupied a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, shaded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Freedfolk gathered quietly, forming a circle around the fresh-dug earth. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Caleb Turner stood at the front, his blacksmith's hands folded, his face carved from stone. Beside him, Ruth Clay stood silent, her small hand clasped in his. She'd barely spoken since they'd found her hiding in Caleb's forge yesterday, too terrified to make a sound. She wore a simple dress, too big for her frame. Her eyes were dry. She'd cried herself empty. Worth oversaw the burial himself, making sure it was done properly, making sure Jonas was laid to rest with dignity, not shame. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, he stepped forward and placed a Union medal on the lid, one of his own, earned at Shiloh, an act of war, he said quietly, between heaven and hell. He looked at the assembled freedfolk. No charges will be filed. No arrests will be made. What happened yesterday? He paused, searching for words that wouldn't come. What happened yesterday was beyond any law I know how to enforce. He turned and walked away, leaving them to their grief. That evening, Worth sat in his temporary office, a room above the general store, and wrote his official report. His hand moved slowly, carefully choosing each word. The destruction of the Clay County Church resulted from accumulated tensions following Reconstruction. The perpetrator, Jonas Clay, acted in response to the unlawful execution of his wife by vigilante forces. While his actions cannot be condoned, they must be understood in context. The true criminals, those who organized and participated in extrajudicial killings, perished in the fire. This matter is closed. The remaining Klan elements have disbanded and fled the county. Federal presence is no longer required. The freedmen population has begun rebuilding their community. Order has been restored. He signed it, sealed it, and sent it north with the morning courier. In the colored cemetery, Ruth knelt beside her father's grave. The earth was still fresh, not yet settled. She'd brought a wildflower, a black-eyed Susan she'd picked from the roadside. She placed it carefully on the mound, her small fingers patting the soil around its stem. Caleb stood a respectful distance away, giving her space. When she finally rose, he moved forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You'll stay with me now," he said softly. "Your mama and daddy, they'd want you looked after proper." Ruth didn't answer, just nodded, her eyes fixed on the grave. Around them, the evening air filled with sound. From the rebuilt cabins near the swamp, voices rose in an old hymn, slow and mournful, but carrying hope beneath the sorrow. "Go down, Moses' way, down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." The song drifted through the cemetery, weaving between the headstones, carrying the story of a man who'd needed only 3 minutes to change everything, who'd knelt in prayer after delivering judgment, who'd closed the gate between heaven and hell. The legend of the giant of Clay County had begun. Marshal Henry Worth sat at his desk in the Jackson Federal Office, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. Rain drummed against the windows, washing away the last of summer's heat. Before him lay a stack of papers, official reports, witness statements, property records, the bureaucratic aftermath of tragedy. He picked up his pen. "To the Honorable Attorney General of the United States, I write to provide a final accounting of the events that transpired in Clay County, Mississippi, during the autumn of 1872. What follows is not merely a recitation of facts, but a testimony to the moral bankruptcy of Reconstruction justice, and to the terrible price paid by those who dared demand their freedom be honored in deed, not merely in word." Wirth paused, gathering his thoughts. How did you explain Jonas Clay to men who'd never felt a whip, who'd never watched their wives murdered for sport? The case began with the death of 9 Ku Klux Klan members on the property of Jonas Clay, a freedman and former Union sapper. The Klan had come to execute him and his family under the pretense of avenging Thomas Dunley, son of local leader Reverend James Dunley. Clay defended his home using military tactics acquired during his service. 9 men died in 3 minutes. What followed revealed a conspiracy of staggering scope. Thomas Dunley had not been recently murdered. He had died years prior, killed by his own father after assaulting an enslaved woman on the Dunley plantation. Reverend Dunley fabricated the recent death to unite white supremacists under a banner of racial terror. He exploited his son's corpse to justify atrocities. The pen moved faster now, Worth's anger bleeding into the ink. Jonas Clay did not flee. Instead, he brought the bodies to the church steps and declared his actions self-defense. For this honesty, his wife Eliza was publicly executed without trial. When Clay retaliated by setting fire to the church during a Klan gathering, he killed 17 men, including Reverend Dunley. I recovered Clay's body by the riverbank. He had not attempted escape. He knelt in prayer, holding his wife's burial shawl, and died from smoke inhalation and burns sustained during the fire. His final act was one of surrender, not violence. Worth lifted the glass and drank. The whiskey burned, but it was nothing compared to the memory of Jonas's face, peaceful, even in death, like a man who'd finally laid down a burden too heavy to carry. 18 white men perished as a direct result of the Dunley conspiracy. 0 convictions will be pursued. The perpetrators are dead, and the surviving Klan members have fled the county. Federal occupation would serve no purpose except to inflame tensions further. But I must state plainly what the law cannot acknowledge. Jonas Clay was not a murderer. He was a man driven to desperation by a system that promised freedom while permitting slavery by another name. He was a soldier who used his training to protect his family when the law refused to do so. He was a husband who watched his wife hanged for the crime of existing. History will call him a murderer. Official records will list him as a perpetrator of violence, a criminal who took justice into his own hands. But to those who lived through these events, to the freedmen who rebuilt their homes after Klan raids, to the children who learned to fear white hoods more than nightmares, Jonas Clay was something else entirely. He was the last man in Clay County who kept the promise of freedom. Worth signed his name, sealed the letter, and sent it north with the morning dispatch. He knew it would be buried in some archive, filed away, and forgotten. The official story would be simpler. Racial tensions resolved. Order restored. The truth was always more complicated. Spring arrived early the following year. In the colored section of Clay County, where cabins clustered near the swamp's edge, the sound of hammers filled the air. Freed folk worked together, raising walls where the old church had stood. They sang while they worked, old spirituals that had survived slavery and war. The new church rose slowly but steadily, pine boards weathered to gray, a simple steeple reaching toward the sky. Someone suggested calling it Second Baptist, but Ruth Clay spoke up from where she sat watching the construction. New Deliverance, she said quietly. That's what Papa would want. The name stuck. By summer, the church was complete. White-painted and proud, it stood as testament to resilience. But the real masterpiece stood at its gates. Caleb Turner had spent months carving it, working late into the night in his forge, shaping oak into something approaching the divine. The statue depicted a massive kneeling figure, head bowed, hands folded around a flowing cloth. The face was deliberately shadowed, features suggested rather than defined. Any man, every man, the eternal archetype of sacrifice. When they unveiled it, the entire community gathered. "This here's for remembering," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just Jonas, but everyone who paid the price for our freedom. Everyone who stood when standing meant dying." They dedicated the statue on a Sunday morning. Ruth, now 9 years old and living in Caleb's household, stepped forward and placed the first offering at its base, a bundle of lilies tied with ribbon. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. Time passed. Seasons turned. The children who'd been too young to remember learned the story from their elders. They learned about the giant of Vicksburg, who'd needed only 3 minutes to change the world. They learned about the night the church burned, when judgment came down like fire. They learned a song, 3 minutes of thunder, a lifetime of peace. The giant knelt praying, when vengeance would cease, it became tradition. Every Sunday after services, the children would gather at the statue and sing. Their voices carried across the cemetery, where Jonas and Eliza rested side by side, their graves marked by simple stones. The county changed, slowly, grudgingly, but it changed. White folks learned to mind their business. Just jumping in, make sure to subscribe if you hear this. Enjoy the rest of the story. The Klan never reformed in Clay County. The memory of that burning church proved more powerful than any federal law. When outsiders asked why, the locals would just shake their heads and mutter about ghosts. The freed folk knew better. It wasn't ghosts keeping the peace. It was the promise that if evil returned, justice might return with it, terrible and swift and absolute. Ruth grew tall and quiet, carrying her grief like a shawl around her shoulders. She worked in Caleb's forge, learning metalwork, finding purpose in creation rather than destruction. Every Sunday, without fail, she visited New Deliverance. She would stand before the statue, studying the carved features that might have been her father's face, might have been any man's face. The artist had captured something essential, not Jonas Clay the individual, but Jonas Clay the symbol, the idea of a man who'd rather die than submit. She always brought lilies, always placed them at the statue's base, where previous offerings had faded to mulch and nourished the grass. On a Sunday evening in late summer, as the sun began its descent behind the western pines, Ruth made her weekly pilgrimage. The church had emptied, families dispersing to their homes for supper. She walked alone through the cemetery, past rows of headstones that told stories of survival and struggle. At the statue, she knelt and placed fresh lilies beside yesterday's flowers. The carved figure loomed above her, massive and eternal, caught forever in its posture of prayer. "The singing was beautiful today," she said softly. "More children every week. Caleb says we'll need to expand the church soon." A breeze stirred the Spanish moss in the nearby oaks. Somewhere, a mockingbird rehearsed its stolen songs. "They're learning to read now." Miss Johnson from Jackson came down to teach. Says education's the real freedom. Ruth smiled faintly. "You would have liked that." The sun touched the horizon, painting everything gold and crimson. Shadows lengthened across the cemetery, pooling around headstones and monuments. Ruth stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. She looked toward the swamp, where her father had once hidden his family, where he'd made his final choice between survival and justice. The light caught the edge of the statue's face, illuminating the carved wood for just a moment. In that instant, the shadows shifted, and the features seemed almost alive, almost smiling. "Rest now, Papa," Ruth whispered. She turned and walked toward home, leaving the statue standing watch over the graves of those who'd paid freedom's price. Behind her, the carved figure knelt in eternal prayer. The face remained shadowed, powerful, impossible to fully see or fully understand. In one hand, it held a carved shawl that seemed to ripple in the fading light. The sun sank lower, and darkness claimed the cemetery inch by inch. But the statue remained, a sentinel, a promise, a warning, a reminder that 3 minutes of thunder could echo across lifetimes. And in the growing dark, if you listened carefully, you might hear the faint sound of children singing, "3 minutes of thunder, a lifetime of peace." I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.